Today we are continuing with our small series about the different Vespa models. And as you can easily see, today we talk about the Vespa large frame. Last time we introduced you to the Vespa wide frame. The Vespa large frame is the successor. Last time it was so nice with our expert Olli. That's why he's back today. Big applause for Olli.
Hello, I'm Oliver. My second passion is collecting Vespa large frame, some of which I have brought with me today.
Last time we explained to you the best way to identify a Vespa wide frame. We want to continue with that today, with the large frame. We want to explain to you how to recognize a Vespa large frame and what the most important features are.
At Piaggio, the engine concept was changed. The engine block was now one piece, so the swing arm and the engine was no longer separate as they used to be. The whole thing consisted of only one block now. This one also made the swing arm slimmer. The frame was also becoming slimmer because the carburetor flap was no longer needed. You can also see very clearly that the rear of the Vespa is no longer one piece, but two pieces. There was a left and right pressing mold. This made the vehicle lighter and overall more rigid.
The whole engine structure was overturned. Initially, with the wide frame, the swing arm and engine were separate parts that were bolted together. With the large frame, both were only one part. This made everything a bit more compact and stable. There has also been some tidying up inside the engine. While controlling the Kickstarter on the wide frame was still relatively complicated and fragile, everything has now been simplified. Above all, the engine also offered more resources. There was more space for the cylinder, and the carburetor position was changed as well. You remember, the last wide frame, the GS150, had the carburetor installed above the cylinder. That was already a modernization, which then was transferred to the Vespa large frame. But it was all still a bit of a patchwork, because it was all built on the old engine. And now the engine has been designed from scratch, just as one would like it to be at this point. Here, you can see the biggest distinctive feature between a Vespa large frame and a Vespa wide frame. No more carburetor flap, no more cutout for the right side panel. In addition, the whole thing has become much narrower here, and you can also see very nicely how the frame is divided here.
You can also see from the front that the leg shield on the large frame is slimmer compared to the wide frame. The side panels were also pushed in a little. Since the frame was now in two parts, the whole model became slimmer overall.
The Vespa large frame was very successful and built for over 40 years. This means that there was a relatively large variety of models during this period, often with only minor changes. But of course, we want to introduce you to the most important models. We want to start with the first Vespa large frame, the V&A. With this one, as is often the case at the beginning, a lot was different to later models. There were many details that changed later.
In 1958, the first large frame model came onto the market, the V&A. You can easily see that many components from the wireframe series had been implemented here as well. For example, the one-piece fender, or the leg shield that still was a tad wider than on the successor models. The letters on the front were also the same as on the wide frame models. The lamp with a diameter of 105 mm was adopted from the Struzzo. A striking feature also the floor run is on a tunnel area. The swing saddle and luggage rack were still a part of the initial equipment too.
Two very interesting technical details that were very different with the V&A than with later large frame models. First, this engine still has a piston-controlled intake, like the GS150. Later, it is characteristic of the large frame that the intake was controlled via a rotary valve, with a few exceptions, but we'll get to that later. Another detail, the V&A had a split steering head for the first time. That was progressive back then. But after the V&A, Piaggio moved away from the split steering head again, and it took them about 20 years to bring it back onto the market. The next model that we want to show you is this one, the VBB. And as you can see, this model is still very similar to the VNA. There are a couple reasons for this. I would like to briefly explain to you what the model names VNA and VBB are all about. Back then, back in the days of Wideframe, the model designations always contained a V for Vespa. This was followed by an N for 125cc and a B for 150cc on these models. The VBB is already a Vespa 150. Then comes a third letter, A or B, and it simply designates the early models with A and the later models with B. So VNA means V, Vespa, N, 125, A, early model. And VBB stands for V, Vespa, B, 150cc, B, later series. But Olli will tell us more about the specific details that were changed here.
At the VBB you can see that the fender now also consists of two parts. Left and right sides were pressed separately. The headlight suddenly had a diameter of 150 mm. In addition, we now had a one-piece cast steering head like the one we saw on the GS150 from the Wideframe series. Another detail, the floor runners were also available on the floorboard and were also replaced by a rubber mat in the tunnel area. Otherwise, the model remained largely the same.
Very important. With this model, the rotary valve engine was introduced. These models all had a rotary valve inlet already, and that was a characteristic that the large frame has kept until the end. With a few exceptions. And about this exception, we'll talk now. After this series came my personal favorite Vespa, the most beautiful scooter that has ever been built, in my opinion. This one, the GS4 or GS160. This scooter is so important and interesting because there were a lot of new features and technical innovations that were only retained for a short time and then thrown out again. Why? I don't know. But Olli will tell you more about those innovations and what makes the GS4 so special.
Piaggio has always loved making sports models. The GS160 is the successor model to the GS150. A special feature here was that this model was the first large frame model to have 10-inch tires as standard. The saddle disappeared completely and was replaced by a bench. For the first time there was space for the spare wheel under the side panel, which was now removable. The second series of the GS160 had a glove compartment, the first series a small flap on the side panel. However, this was not very successful.
But as nice as this scooter is, together with the SS180, it remains a special case, and we would like to explain it to you in more detail later. We had the beginning of the 60s, and Piaggio wanted to spice up the design a bit. Not only the design, but above all, the frame geometry. The scooters got faster and faster, and the GS160 already hit the 100 kilometers an hour. That's why they tried not only to make the frame more rigid, but also to change the geometry so that it reliably keeps a straight line even at high velocity. It all started with this model, the Vespa GL. We have a special example here, where someone has gone a little crazy in terms of color, stickers and whatnot. But you can still see how it started. First of all, the cascade became a little wider and more angular. The same change happened for the side panels. You can see it even better with later models than the GL. But here too, the shape has clearly changed. That's also very visible on the steering head with the trapezoidal headlight. Those are the external characteristics that are first to be recognized. But as I said, very important is the construction of the frame. The frame itself hasn't really gotten any longer, but the steering head angle has changed. The angle at which the fork is to the ground has become flatter. This means that the caster and the wheelbase are changed. Both of these keep a scooter at a straighter line when they grow bigger. So that's a characteristic that all Vespas had from the GL and all later models.
With the GL model in particular, Piaggio tried to be a little sportier, for example with the trapezoidal headlights. The design became more angular overall. In general, one can say that all 150 models had the spare wheel at the leg shield and the luggage compartment on the side panel. All cubic classes larger had a glove compartment and the spare wheel under the side panel.
At the beginning of the 1970s, the last model in this series was released, which also represented the crowning glory, the Rally. The Rally was available with 180cc, later also with 200cc. So, the Rally models were also the fastest Vespas that existed up to that time. There was also a slight change to the engine compared to the smaller models. The cylinder is arranged a little differently and is slightly crooked. You might be able to see this here if the camera can capture that. You can always recognize the Rally models on the engine side by the fact that the manifold comes out at an angle, while older ones come out straight. As you can see, it all became a little sportier. However, when it comes to the optical subtleties, Olli is the expert.
As you can see at the Rally, the headlight was bigger and extended to 135mm. The Rally head was also used in the GTR or Sprint Veloce models, simply to have a better light output. In addition, this model had a glove compartment, and the spare wheel was attached to the left side under the side panel. It is noteworthy that this model, the Rally 180, has already been delivered to the USA, and that with separate lubrication.
As you can see, it's similar to the wide-frame models. The scooter gets faster and the headlights get bigger, so you can actually see where you're going. It all makes sense. The change in headlight size was also retained in the last series of the Vespa large frame, the Vespa PX.
The Rally 200 model series ended in 1978. Although it still got an electronic ignition at the end, there was already a new market launch in 1977 with the PX model. This model was built for almost 40 years, until 2016. And now Jesko will tell you more about the technical stuff.
You can imagine that a scooter that has been built for 40 years has been renewed and rebuilt a lot. That was also, of course, the case with the Vespa PX. As successful as the PX was, they couldn't just leave it with the release date of 1977 over all this time, of course. I would like to limit myself to the most important changes here, so that it doesn't get too boring. Certain things can be seen quite well. Here, for example, we have a model from the first PX series. This has a slightly more rounded cascade than the later model. The arrangement of the choke and fuel tab is also different. This is mainly due to the next model that came out in this series, the PX Lusso. There was an important change in the PX Lusso. The models in this series had separate lubrication as standard for all displacement classes and engines. Down here you could see through an oil sight glass whether there was any oil left. Because of the separate lubrication, you could now refuel without pouring oil into the gasoline. Oil was filled up separately and had to be refilled far less often. Then there was a big change in 1998 that you can even see on this model because it has been retrofitted. The disc brake. You can see it here. The model here has now been upgraded with a SIP brake caliper and an SIP shock absorber. But in principle, the disc brake looked like this from 1998 onwards. This disc brake brought a decisive and important advantage when braking. A second change that was made at the time was similar: the clear glass headlights. It has already been retrofitted here as well. We have talked about the modernization of headlights a number of times. However, this is really a milestone, because every headlight change that happened before in the history of Vespa was actually just different degrees of darkness. Here, you saw for the first time where you were going. These are also changes that were retained until the end of the series. A few chrome accessories were added later to make the PX look a bit more like older models again. Some like it, others not so much. My personal favorite PX is the very old PX, so from the shape as we have it right here. The end of the PX series in 2016 was also the definitive end of the classic Vespa large frame. That means we're almost done with our video, if it weren't for a few special models. I'm standing here between two very special models, between the GS160 and the SS180. We had a short look at the GS earlier, but I took it out again because these models don't really fit into the history of the large frame. Both have a lot of technical features that are only available on these models. We would like to have a closer look at them now and explain why they have prevailed or not, if we know. As the successor to the GS150, we have a mixture of large frame models within the GS4. For example, we already have the lighter, stiffer frame. However, what makes this model so special is the engine. Here, we have a piston-controlled engine again, which the GS150 also had. The large frames don't actually have that kind of engine anymore, but this model has it. There are also a few other special features, such as this fork here. This is the first time that a spring strut has been installed at the front. These are all things that have been retained in the successor model, the SS180. Here, we have a beautiful and very original model, where you can see very well that the shock absorber is one piece for the first time. I'll take off that side panel quickly. Here, you can see that the carburetor sits above the cylinder, because a piston control was installed here. These are things that actually no longer existed with large frames, and that have been used again here. Why they didn't continue it? Unfortunately, I don't know that either. Well, a piston-controlled engine is of course not the greatest from an environmental point of view. It requires more oil so that the connecting rod bearing is better lubricated, and in terms of timing, it is not as environmentally friendly as the later rotary valve engine. What you can also see very nicely here is the cylinder arrangement, which was only seen again at the rally. Here's that angled outlet, and the studs are arranged a bit differently. That was transferred into the rally as well. So that was a design that was only found on models that were over 150 cc. That is also a commonality with regard to the glove box up here and the spare wheel under the left side panel. Apparently, only models with more than 150 cc have that. In addition, the whole engine design was also different. It had a 60mm stroke and a slightly more compact engine. The gear compartment in particular was more compact. A weak point in large frame motors that only these motors did not have. But for some reason it has been abolished. Probably because they simply went on to using the rotary valve control for all models, which was already present in the other engines. That is why, in my opinion, this engine has also been abolished. I don't know why this strut was removed again. Do you know that, Ollie?
Nope.
So, we don't know. Good opportunity for you guys. If you know, write us in the comments. Why was this strut abolished again? Because that's something that didn't come back until 1977 in the PX. The PX then had a shock absorber at the front, which was a little further developed and against which the brake was supported. Here, the shock absorber is supported against the suspension arm. It's not quite as advanced yet. The later technology of the PX also prevented the nodding off when braking. But the curious thing about these two models is that the engine, fork, and the centrally split wheel wheels were unique to these models. These features only existed for a few years and were then changed again. Two very beautiful and progressive models that, unfortunately, have not been continued. There is only one special model left that we would like to introduce to you, the Vespa T5. This scooter here is a Vespa T5. And as with many of its predecessors, the name says it all here as well. Just like the Vespa GS, Grand Sport, the Vespa SS, Super Sport, the Vespa T4, Touring, or the Vespa Rally, suited for rally driving, the T5 on the Vespa T5 stands for Traversi Cinque, T Traversi, transfer, 5. Cinque. For the first time, this engine had 5 transfer channels through which the mixture could get into the cylinder. This is so special because A. Previous models did not have it, and B. It is a cylinder layout that is still the go-to design of modern two-stroke engines. The Vespa T5 was an attempt to transport the PX into the 80s. The 80s, you remember, pink leggings and Rubik cubes. That's probably why this scooter looks like a cube. Here at the rear, for example, a sheet metal box was simply placed on top of the frame. You can see that quite well here. The rear end was simply lengthened. Underneath is actually the regular PX tail. That's why the bench is longer and also quite comfortable. The taillight is also designed differently, and there is also a bumper. These are all small changes that were all applied to the old frame. You can see it even better at the front. A steering head with a large square headlight is attached here. Very important and also quite interesting, the relatively large speedometer with an integrated tachometer already existed as analog version. Here it's digital, which is also totally 80s. Optically, it is certainly disputable. Some like it, some don't. What remains is the engine, and the engine is great. Piaggio has managed to build a 125cc engine with a modern cylinder layout, which is, for the first time, as strong as the 200 cubic version. So far, the most powerful model has been the PX200 with 12 horsepower. But this 125cc engine also has 12 horsepower, so it's just as powerful with less displacement. That were the most important facts about the Vespa T5. What we are still missing, or perhaps not missing in large frame history, is the Vespa Cosa. We decided not to count it to the large frame, but instead to the Cosa. Olli, maybe a little tip at the end. Can you give someone who is new to the Vespa large frame world a recommendation with which model it is most worthwhile to start?
Well, that depends a little on your wallet. If you just want to get into the large frame world and get a taste of it, then I would start with the PX model. You can get them in good condition for around 2,000 euros. If you want an older look, there are definitely some models such as VNB, VBB or Sprint, which are also available in a price range between 2,000 and 3,000 euros.
What has unfortunately become very expensive these days is something like the GS4. But above all, a rally. I think a rally is the most expensive thing you can buy from all the things here these days. I think the prices have risen a lot.
It has to be said that a sports model such as GS, SS, Rally cost you close to 5 digits in good condition. I think it's better to look at VBB, Sprint or Sprint Veloce models. The advantage is that you can install a PX engine or a modern engine in any model.
Exactly. With all the scooters that we showed you today, you could interchange the engines among them. That makes it so charming, because you can also equip oldies with modern engines, for which there are also a lot of accessories and tuning parts available. In principle, this is open to the top, and you can lose yourself in it for years. A little tip if you decide on a PX as an entry-level model. The PX Lusso models are currently the cheapest models. The later PX models from '98 onwards have slightly better technology, but terribly poor rust prevention, like Alfa Romeos from the '80s. Please, pay close attention to what the frame looks like if you go for such a model. That's it for today with our small 101 about the Vespa large frame. I would like to thank my expert Olli very much. Olli, did you like it?
It was really great fun with you, Jesko. It was very informative for me as well.
I'm glad. Thanks. Olli gifted me the GS4, so I take that one home. Otherwise, I'm looking forward to the next video, which will be about the Vespa small frame. If you like this video, press the bell, like, comment, and whatever else you can think of. See you soon. Bye.